I am so happy to be here for Portal to Ascension. Neil Gar, I'm Alan Steinfeld. We do a lot of projects together. But I'm really happy because one of the true geniuses, and I don't use that word all the time, just some of the time. No, really one of the creative minds of our time, one who's pushing the envelope of combining spirituality and science into the new science of spirituality. It's very rare you have someone who's so equipped to deal with both those levels and bridge them in a very seamless way with new technologies, new ideas, and also an evolving spiritual matrix, which our world is moving into, desperately needing. And Dan Winter has formulated over the last 20 and 30 years a kind of whole new understanding of the incarnational process, why we're here, where we came from, what we're supposed to do here, and where we're going. So, Dan, I think you keep evolving your theories, and I'm really excited about what you have to say. So, go ahead. The name of this lecture is.
It's the physics of bliss, lucid dreaming, telepathy, and successful death.
That's why I guess we're here, right? So, all right, I'm going to step out of the way, but I might jump in if you lose me, us, them. And also, people in the chat, you can ask questions too. So, all right, Dan, you're on your own. Go for it.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. And yes, that is the point, that what makes this fun for everybody is your questions and the dialogue part. So please, this is informal, relaxed, and playful and fun for you, we hope. And questions are welcome. We'll have a Q&A session at the end, but some during are fun too. So yes, the topic assignment for the day, physics of bliss, lucid dreaming, telepathy, and successful death. Now, actually, Neil kindly put a list of 8 sort of bullet points, which were the starting point for this conversation, which have to do with Kesjan body and rainbows with Tibetans dying, things like that. And so we'll start with those bullet points. But to just a preview here, the core science of everything we're going to talk about today has to do with one core principle, and that is that when there is appropriate electrical compression, and I do mean compression around the body, golden ratio brainwaves for bliss, sitting at a sacred site, having a eureka experience, these things all have one thing in common electrically, and they put the squeeze on. They implode, compress. They squeeze, literally.
Wait, Dan, sorry to interrupt. Compression. Let's start there. What do you mean when you say compression? Let's describe what that is. Yeah.
Not to give an abstruse answer, but when lasers meet from opposite directions and they squeeze the center, which is called a phase conjugate mirror, very symmetrically, they do what's called conjugate, which means all of the wavelength recursively add and multiply. It's like pine cones meet and kiss. And at that center point of that kind of compression, there emerges something called longitudinal wave, longitudinal coherence. And so that's where we're going with this. And actually, this relates to the question that Alan asked before too. Would I talk about what I mean by conjugate consciousness?
Yeah.
I think there's noise in the background there, Alan. Yeah, just.
Oh, I'll mute it.
Yeah, thank you. So conjugate consciousness refers to this idea that as the waves converge, visualize a caduceus or a pine cone, they recursively add and multiply constructively, and that process is implosive and accounts for what is called in physics phase conjugation. As in conjugal relations, when you get married, your genes conjugate, they add and multiply, and check to see whether there is constructive interference. So that conjugation means that there is a set of heterodynes, which means adding and multiplying of resonances or wave interferences. And when that conjugation is constructive, obviously idealized by golden mean ratio phi, which is fractality perfected, when the conjugation is constructive and the fractality is perfected, and fractality is by definition, perfected compression. So when those waves add and multiply, conjugate constructively, there is a form of implosion. And the most practical known physics for that is what's called a phase conjugate mirror, where lasers exactly tuned but 180 degrees out of phase meet at a super dielectric, which means a superconductive material, barium strontium titanate, for example, very high dielectric, meaning charge distribution permissive, which means it allows the pine cones to kiss. And when the lasers meet in the phase conjugate mirror, imagine we're talking about the coating on the back of Nostradamus's scrying cup, for example, a phase conjugate mirror, or the obsidian mirror used by the Olmec for ancestor phone calls. So this process of conjugating phases in the phase conjugate mirror has very interesting properties. In physics, this was the first time they ever measured negentropy, time reversal, self-organization, literally returning back to a state of previous increased order, negentropy. So phase conjugation in optics is the first place physics ever measured negentropy, which means self-organization or moving. Yes, go
Can
ahead.
you relate that to the human body then? Why are you talking about this?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly where. So what we're saying is later when we measure golden ratio in brain waves at the moment of Bliss, at the moment Jean-Charles Moyen teleported with witnesses, this is a form of conjugation or implosion of harmonics. And when this implosion of harmonics happens, successful compression, implosive compression, centripetal compression, negentropic compression, all the magic stuff happens. And the way we're going to learn about how that works very specifically is the one thing that definitely happens is that the primarily transverse electromagnetics around your body, around your aura, that the transverse or up and down part of the electromagnetic wave is how all of electromagnetic communication works in our technologies. However, there's another kind of transmission of electromagnetic fields, which is called longitudinal, sometimes called scalar. And in that form, the direction of resonant compression in the wave is parallel to the direction of propagation instead of perpendicular. And now we're going to do one little picture here. Let me just see if I can get that up. Yeah, why they fall. So do you see my little picture here? I hope, yeah. So you see on the left, the primary part of the wave of your body's electromagnetic is a transverse wave, which is electromagnetics is the direction of resonance or motion, vibration is perpendicular to the direction of propagation.
But where's the wave of our body, Dan? Where's that happening?
We're talking about now specifically the generalized physics. You could use this visualization to directly imagine what happens when you make golden ratio in brain waves, for example, very measurable. Here's the golden ratio right here, okay? So when you get that golden ratio cascade and see on the side view of that vortex cone, remember we talked about pine cones kissing noses, and you see the 10 spirals of the golden mean in side view makes the perfected caduceus. And at the tip of that squirt gun, at the length called Planck, the Planck length in time is the musical key signature of every wave physics has ever measured. So at that Planck threshold, the squeezing process is completed, and out the other side emerges a wave that's where the compression is moving parallel to the direction of propagation. And that means that the compression has been aligned. And if you implode that longitudinal or scalar wave, squeezing to center from opposite directions symmetrically, you can create centripetal force, negentropy, gravity, all the magic stuff. In fact, that specifically, that longitudinal wave is sometimes called scalar, is the subject of everything we wish to talk about today, which is why it's very important that you get a little sense of what we mean by a longitudinal wave. So remember, that compressional or longitudinal or scalar wave only emerges from things like DNA and your brain waves when there's an implosive squeezing down the pine cone, because the transverse wave is much less organized and the longitudinal wave is much more directional, much more focused, and much more able to create centripetal force. Imagine if you wanted to implode a nucleus, or you reduce radiation for radioactivity, for example. You use the longitudinal wave component centripetally, and you create implosive squeezing. It's like the well-designed tomato juicer. You couldn't get a better squeeze. You need a longitudinal wave to do that. So this longitudinal wave is specifically then bounces around, and longitudinal electromagnetics will pass through about anything. Visualize now the Faraday cage through which Ingo Swann repeatedly lit that thermistor, a flame, with his mind repeatedly in the lab. So there he is, he's lighting a flame at a distance with his mind through a Faraday cage. And now we know the physics. The reason he was able to light that thermistor with his mind through the Faraday cage, literally a flame in his mind, which is the reason my invention is called flameinmind.com, because when you make golden ratio implosion in your brainwaves, you create that implosive centripetal force, like squeezing the rose before it unpacks. The squeezing has to be perfect for the unpacking to be. The unpacking is the radiance we call bliss. But what has to come first is the perfect squeezing, and that's true of a rose. So Ingo Swann was able to send those waves from his mind and act at a distance through a Faraday cage because those waves were longitudinal or scalar, and they will pass through about anything, actually. However, they will not interact with what is on the way. You won't see them. They're very invisible, and they're hard to pick up, unless what happens is the longitudinal waves travel and they enter what's called an array. And this is the point of everything. I would like to, please listen very carefully to what we mean by an array, because this is going to become literally the electric field of the collective unconscious, the communion of saints, heaven, where you go when you die, how you steer something down the ley line at a distance. It's all about inhabiting the array. That's the point. Now, let me give you an example of an array. You know, in mathematics, you have an array of numbers, and you can act with algebra on a whole array at once. It's like visualize a nest, a matrix in 3D. You act on the array. Well, it's basically a nest of nodes. Now, it happens that the array that longitudinal or compressional waves must form is fractal, actually. And it is only and always this geometry, which is why this golden ratio perfected geometry is the dominant geometry of all orbital mechanics. I repeat, all orbital mechanics are dominated by golden ratio for this reason. This is how you create and stabilize gravity and atmosphere and consciousness, because this is the only way to make centripetal implosive force in that array. So the compressional longitudinal waves, visualize them, they're leaving your brain during bliss. Now, if you happen to be sitting on a magnetic line, which is really very helpful if you would like bliss process, then the nodes of that array are already partially lined up for you. That's why every really successful labyrinth, stone circle, church, cozy rev mirror, Therify, all of these things do better when they're on a cross point in that magnetic array, defining the sacred sites we call the Earth grid, that dodecaecosa. So the reason is that the longitudinal or compressional waves, when they reach the node of that array, the compression bounces in and out of the pine cones again, and there is an exchange of inertia from the longitudinal wave, which is transparent to about everything, back into a potentially heat-containing transverse wave. Now, I don't want to lose you here. When I said heat-containing, I mean specifically, if you take longitudinal waves, say microwave, and you cross them at a distance, you can contain heat at a distance. I repeat, I'm describing for you now the holy grail solution to every problem in fusion research, the ability to contain heat at a distance. In fact, what I'm describing to you now is the answer to Einstein's confusion when he said all action at a distance is spooky. So part of how he didn't learn why objects fall to the ground is directly because he didn't learn the physics of action at a distance. Now, interestingly, Tom Bearden completed all the equations to effectively prove that, in effect, gravity waves are these longitudinal or compressional electromagnetic waves. And you can see why, because when the compressional waves meet and converge at the perfect pine cones, there is implosive compression. And implosive compression means that geometry of compression turns compression towards center into acceleration of charge towards center. And there is no other definition of gravity than acceleration of charge. So if you learned how to make compression turn into acceleration towards center, you have answered Einstein's lifetime mess, which is why objects fall to the ground, because that's what generates that acceleration towards center. And you see, this is the sadness of our physics on this planet, is because they have no clue, apparently no clue, why objects fall to the ground, and they have no clue of the cause of any centripetal force. And by the way, electronegativity is centripetal. Consciousness is centripetal. Gravity is centripetal. So you can't know why consciousness or gravity exist unless you know why charge becomes centripetal. And the reason charge gets centripetal is charge collapse is perfected. Now, physics is aware that perfect charge collapse causes gravity and causes consciousness. That's not new information. But physics is not aware of the cause of charge collapse. And I answered that question in my newest book, Planckfire.com, Planckphire, Planckfire.com, because the fire, literally the fire's ray of Planck, that universal wavelength, that geometry creates implosive charge collapse. And that's the cause of consciousness and gravity and human bliss, which we're discussing here. So there's a specific place we want to take this conversation is then what would then enable you to inhabit the array? Now, we are going to give an example of an array. The best example of inhabiting an array, clearly the best example, is the synapses in your brain. I mean, visualize Indra's net, a net of fireflies, the synapses in your brain, okay? Now that is an array. It's a perfect description of an array. Now, obviously, you already inhabit an array. It's called the synapses in your brain. You're inhabiting an array right now. It's clear, it's simple. There's nothing else to inhabit but array. In this case, the fireflies in the spark gaps. Well, if you interview the kids who they made golden ratio in their brain waves, and then they're blindfolded, and they say a vortex tube forms inside their head. It comes to a point. The plasma vortex comes to a point, and the inner muscle to do that is the physics of psychokinesis and lucid dreaming and how you teleport, is that you make the inner muscle to make the golden ratio caduceus cascade in your brainwaves harmonics, and that puts the squeeze on, making that plasma vortex centripetal, and it comes to the point. And the kids will always tell you that when that vortex inside their head comes to a point, it becomes an eyeball, and then blindfolded, they can see. So that vortex coming to a point is the only real description of the actual physics of consciousness. Consciousness is, I repeat, consciousness is that plasma vortex. And that vortex coming to a point and becoming an eyeball is what you take with you when you lucid dream, remote view, astral travel, and when you die successfully. You're taking a plasma donut, which is your consciousness. And when you take that with you, that becomes the physics of all perception from outside the body, for example. And so now we know why you can't you can't lucid dream into an aluminum box because plasma donuts can't make it there. Oops. There's a lot of limitations once you understand what you inhabit when you lucid dream and when you die. You centripetally begin to propagate into the array, and you pull strings in that array like a nest, and you gain leverage on the array. So at first, and here I'll give you an example. Supposing you're sitting there and everything's pretty quiet in the room, and suddenly maybe your eyes are closed, and suddenly there's like a piece of wood or something crackles in the room. There's literally a crackling sound in the room. And in your sort of dreaming reverie, you sort of wake up and said, "Boy, it felt like that was inside my body." Think about it. You're in there. Maybe it's a church. And when there's a crackling in the church, if you're very relaxed and still and praying and meditating, and then something sort of moves at a distance, maybe a crackling sound, whatever it is, your first intuitive impression is that happened inside your body, when in fact it's outside your body. The reason it felt like it was inside your body is a profound clue that when you entered that stillness and you got centripetal, you began to have the inner muscle to inhabit that array. Now, at first, the process of generating feeling, where you feel something outside as if it's inside, compassion is an example where you turn inside out recursively. We'll play some slides. The good example here is, as we said before, when Gurdjieff said, "Well, you can't learn the sacred gymnastic until you can put enough feeling." What did he mean by feeling? When you can put enough feeling in your baby finger to cause it to begin to tingle, presence. So you eventually come to recognize that your inner focus consciousness has a powerful, simple, electrical centripetal force, which gains inertia, gains centripetal force. And as the electrical nature of your consciousness gains centripetal force, that is the definition of the power of your consciousness, like feeling a squeeze or a vice-like grip, okay? So eventually, first you put your attention in your baby finger and you cause it to tingle, and then you're ready to learn the sacred gymnastic because you've begun to realize you can move the electric tornado with the electrical centripetal force of your attention. Remember, Bill Tiller famously, in his book, Conscious Acts of Creation, measured in dozens of ways that focused human attention causes electric fields to compress. This is measured. This is true. I'm the first one to explain how and why consciousness causes charge to compress, because charge is inherently centripetal and negentropic. So that inner muscle that allowed you to move your baby finger and move your attention into your baby finger, and then your baby finger started to tingle, and you realized that your attention had an electrical power that's movable. Oh, isn't that fun? Now, imagine you are an Aboriginal shaman, and you're sitting there and it looks like you're sleeping, but actually you're doing more than lucid dreaming. You're moving a rainbow 100 miles down the song line, and you're moving it with your attention, okay? Or you're moving a cloud. So you're moving something with your attention at a distance. The inner muscle that allows you to move fields at a distance, the physics of all action at a distance, is this longitudinal array. So you see, the wave nodes of this array, as they're imploding and compressing, the only harmonic series that enables that implosive compression is named PlanckFire.com, golden ratio multiples times Planck, fractality perfected, cause of gravity and consciousness. So as the amount of compression at each node of that array, the geometry of not just DNA, Earth grid, and zodiac, but the geometry of consciousness itself. And the only possible 3D fractal, our star mother kit, goldenmean.info/kit, geometricmodels.com. So this is a very good model of the only array you can sustainably create with longitudinal waves when they interfere, because they must recursively interfere constructively. And this is golden ratio in 3D. That's what it is. And golden ratio is the only way heterodynes, or recursive interference called conjugation, can interfere constructively, recursively. Basically, you can both add and multiply, and that's what recursive constructive heterodyning is, which is another way of saying golden ratio is the solution to compression, because it's the solution to constructive wave interference, and therefore the cause of gravity. And we published the equations in physics journals proving golden ratio is the generalized geometry of perfected constructive interference, and therefore constructed compression, and therefore cause of gravity. And we learn cause of consciousness. So that array, now we're getting back to this idea of what enables you to move something at a distance. Remember, you want a lucid dream, you want a remote heal, you want to astral travel, you want a remote view. It's all about action at a distance. So how does that work? Remember, this is what stumped Einstein, and basically what stumped the physics of planet Earth. The action at a distance is possible because at each compression node of that array, the waves are adding and multiplying constructively, not just wavelength, but phase velocity or speed. And so the connection between the nodes of the array has a component of wave propagation, which are golden ratio multiples times the speed of light. I repeat, the wave connection between nodes of the array have a component of a potentially infinite series of heterodynes of phase velocity of wave interference, which are golden multiple ratio times the speed of light. So this was another mistake from Einstein, thinking the speed of light was the speed limit. No, golden ratio is the doorway to the speed limit of the speed of light, because it allows phase propagation velocities, heterodyne. I give you the example of famously Professor Raymond Chow's probably made more measurements of faster than light velocities than anyone on planet Earth. And he's clear that all of his measurements faster than light were dominant between 1.5 and 1.7 times c the speed of light, centered around 1.618 times c the speed of light, which would be a smoking gun proving my hypothesis about the cause of gravity, for example, because when there's a path through the speed of light out the center of that pine cone, at the center of hydrogen, for example, all based on golden ratio, then the water going down the vortex in your bathtub has a way out. Oh, Einstein sitting there meditating, saying, how can there be infinite non-destructive compression unless there's a way out at the other end of the vortex? So, in other words, the charge has to go somewhere and not be destroyed. And that's what destroyed Einstein, actually, because he couldn't figure out how there was a way out. Well, the way out is simple. When there's implosion down the pinecone vortex, the charge is accelerated through the speed of light by golden ratio at the center into a longitudinal wave. Now, the number of harmonics times golden ratio times c, the speed of light, can increase the more there is compression. Now, I give you an example which may at first seem difficult to understand, and we have slides on this, but I'll break out the slides in a minute. But this is the intro to the intro. But so this implosive compression, when you squeeze all that inertia into the longitudinal array, obviously is not just the physics of lucid dreaming and what you do when you die successfully. It is also obviously the core physics of what a stargate and a portal is and how teleportation works. We have the measurements. Jean-Charles Moyen kindly measured his brainwaves. He has multiple times with witnesses teleported. And just before he did that, massive golden ratio harmonic cascade between alpha to gamma, very high amplitude brainwaves, and during that implosion. So the teleportation that had been witnessed was caused by that implosive compression that enabled distribution into the array. Distribution into the array. The physics of heaven, the physics of lucid dreaming, the physics of the ability to take memory through death. It's all about enabled distribution into the array. So, for example, later in this conversation, when we talk about the geometry that people see at the moment of death, Heinrich Clouvet, form constants, lattice, cobweb, tunnel spiral, implosive compression enables successful death because, and everyone knows at the moment of death, there's a huge squeeze and you see your whole life pass in front of your vision, compressed. Because you have to do squeezing well to be distributed into that array, which is very high pressure. And so this ability to enter this array, it requires that successful death or lucid dreaming is preceded by implosive squeezing, which is how you actually plan to lucid dream, how you plan to have bliss, how you plan to die successfully. Dying successfully, like lucid dreaming, is a solvable, very specific electrical engineering issue, which should be taught by and to electrical engineers. Hello. I'm an electrical engineer, so everything, since I only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. My hammer, my tool is electrical engineering. And so I say that successful death, successful lucid dreaming, is an electrical engineering solvable problem. So then, now let's go back to that Aboriginal shaman. He's sitting there, he's on a magnetic line cross point, what the Aboriginals called song line dreaming track. The places, magnetic line cross points, where Bruce Cathy proved there is a reduction in nuclear critical mass, and now we understand why, because implosive compression is the opposite of radioactivity. Phase conjugation is the opposite of radioactivity. It's how the phase conjugate capacitor, called the Ark of the Covenant, successfully contained radioactives. They called it the Plague of Azoth. So at those nodes of that array, and that's the same place that Kozyrev and Korotkov measured that high quality, military quality telepathy was only available at the nodes of that array. When you're setting up your Kozyrev mirror, visualize as basically a metal cylinder whose diameter is tuned to the microwave of biological bliss, actually. So these metal cylinders, and you put them at the magnetic line cross point, and you measure the magnetic flux density of the magnetic line cross point of the Earth grid in nanoteslas before you decide where to put your Kozyrev mirror, for sure. I was there in Belgium. We did it. And then you sit in the middle, in the center, it's a microwave tuned, and there was military quality telepathy every time. Is that a clue? The implosive phase conjugation at the nodes of the array create enabled distribution, and the whole nest of golden ratio harmonics times the speed of light can make the array bigger and bigger. Now, we give you the practical example. Normally, when you phase conjugate, you arrange lasers in a cube called four-wave mixing, the sacred four directions. The reason Agnihotra works at sunrise and sunset, because the four directions conjugate. So just to get the flavor here, the more mass you get in your cube, the most powerful stargate in this galaxy, the subject of the whole Orion Wars. What were the Orion Wars about? The biggest Stargate. Obviously, the war is over the Stargate. It's classic. That's what you have wars over, access to Stargates. So the biggest war in our galaxy, the Orion Wars, were over the trapezium in Orion, which is a giant cube of masses. And that Stargate, man, It's kick butt. You can accelerate harmonics to the speed of light, like more harmonics than anywhere. And so you can go farther. It's like the real accelerator. Well, this is giving you a clue. Then when you line things up in these four directions correctly and implode them, you can achieve this distribution. So now let's again go back to that. There's that Aboriginal shaman. He's sitting over in a corner. It looks like he's sleeping, but in fact, he's moving a cloud or a rain cloud or an energy field or fertility 100 miles down the song line. Or the other example is famously when Auntie Lorraine, the Bundjalung shaman, our friend, and credit to Jenny on this, but when Auntie Lorraine died in Australia, the huge record-breaking decades remembered storm that went across the continent just after she died was the song line of that Bundjalung Aboriginal tribe, the magnetic line that they had inhabited like a pet puppy for hundreds, if not thousands of years. That magnetic line is where the storm went when she died. So they inhabit these magnetic lines like they're pet puppies, and they steer them and they navigate them. And those clouds of living plasma in that conjugate array become inhabitable. They become steerable. They become the family pet. They become the array that you tweak with your attention. And so, there's the old story of the Aboriginal woman discovers she's pregnant. She said, I felt the baby leap in my womb. And she goes to the village shaman, and they sit down together and they take a flat stone and they make a magnetic map of the magnetic lines, the song lines, of exactly where the pregnant lady first discovered she was pregnant, because the baby would leap in her womb. And that magnetic map on that stone becomes the title deed for the property of the song line that child is destined to inhabit and steer. Do you see? That's called the abraxas point, why the Aboriginal women never go far from the point of incarnation, because they're inhabiting the array centripetal from the place of incarnation, which is why women gain leverage on their lucid dreaming by revisiting the place of their birth. It's the fractality of embeddability of the DNA, for example. So these are all stories about inhabiting the array. So the nature of this array, this nest, which we are going to call communion of saints, collective unconscious, we're going to call it the Champs-Élysées. We're going to call it Hey Ave, where the breath of charge takes flight, heaven. We're going to call it the Plains of Sharon, the Hebrew name for heaven, which I think Lawrence Gardner was right. The virtually potentially infinite unpacking of the electron shells around monoatomic gold phase conjugate dielectric, because the electron shells can unpack into a very, very large array called the Plains of Sharon, literally their name for heaven, Hey Ave, where charge distribution is enabled into the array. So are we beginning to get a clue that how and where and when you die and how you propagate into that array? So what we're saying is that what has been called Kesjan body, rainbow light body, the Ba from the Ka in Egypt, these are all terms for the amount of coherence in your aura, which has been squeezed and is now propagating coherently, longitudinally, and able to act at a distance, thus enabling the physics of lucid dreaming. And we're going to look at the frequency signature of the known physics research of the harmonics that trigger lucid dreaming. Hint, phase conjugate, implosive to Planck, perfect squeezing, measurably triggering lucid dreaming, strong evidence that the physics of lucid dreaming is, after that squeezing, the longitudinal coherence propagating into the array. Then we're going to look at that in terms of the physics of the golden ratio, brain harmonics that can serve remote viewing and astral travel. What is propagating? A component of the longitudinal coherence propagating directionally. That's why they say there's alarms for remote viewers at Area 51. If you can pick up and use a transducer to measure a component of the longitudinal array, hint, Josephson junction, et cetera, then you could potentially measure when the remote viewers arrive. Hello. So this ability to steer and pull strings in that array is this science. And we're saying that Kesjon body, rainbow light body, essentially your astral body, is the coherence that entered that array. And so that's then going to become our language to speak in electrical terms about so many of the ancient, quote unquote, spiritual mysteries. And remember, if that point of charge implosive coherence, when it becomes coherent enough to be distributable, and we're saying the term vril, for example, is actually a name for when the longitudinal propagation becomes coherent and directional. That's what the vril is. That's why it's a healing force, because when it's symmetric, it's implosive and negentropic and therefore healing. It is then the physics of how action at a distance is optimized. It is the physics of how we do healing at a distance with Therify. With the Therify.net healing plasma, many of our centers do action at a distance, healing at a distance regularly. And they have amazing success stories, anecdotally. And we teach that it is not a mystery of how the action at a distance works. It works better at sunrise and sunset, longitudinal coherence, four-wave mixing. It works better at solstice and equinox. It works better if you're on a magnetic line cross. It works better if there's a psychotronic witness. All these things enable distribution into that array, the only physics of action at a distance. So you see, now we're developing a language which can then help us understand all these phenomena. Now, I prepared a whole bunch of visuals here, but I propose that since I've carried on for a while, let's see if there's any questions or conversations that want to happen. Questions that arose during that. Let's see, is there a chat window here? I'm typing. I have the chat. Oh, yes. Okay. How does one block the solar flare emissions from triggering the calcium voltage genes that flood calcium into mitochondria, causing inflammation? Are there specific frequencies? If so, what hurts? How can we protect our magnetosomes from 5G hurting our array? Well, I just grabbed the last question here, but that's fun. Let's say initially that one of the things for which Therify.net plasma, successful in 25 countries, is anecdotally famous is reducing inflammation. In fact, if you look at the Therify blog, you'll find the study by Dr. Gerald Smith in Pennsylvania using infrared to document and measure dramatic reductions in inflammation using Therify phase conjugate plasma, the purple lights. So the reason that would reduce inflammation is because it's electrically centripetal. Remember, the only pain you feel is the love you withhold. Am I quoting the Andromedans? And when you say withholding love, you mean failure to embed. Well, somebody recently asked me about the physics of pain. You know, Valerie thinks that God made a mistake because dogs fart. I mean, make smells. I mean, whatever. And then I said, well, is testosterone a mistake God made? No. Is pain? That's it. I got the question. Is pain a mistake by God? No, actually, pain is a name for charge that bleeds when fractal symmetry is broken. So when you restore compression, which obviously it requires implosive fractality, pain goes away. And it's actually true. You know, when the cut, you squeeze it, and then the pain is reduced. Well, when you make electrical compression, implosive and centripetal, you dramatically reduce pain. This was my friend Elizabeth Rauscher, one of the world's most famous physicists. She had measured the harmonic series of magnetics, which medically reduced pain in her FDA trials, which was one of the background for the physics of Therify. Those are the harmonics, which are pain reducers, which actually come from the bifiller Tesla coil in Therify.net. It's a low frequency harmonic caduceus, which measurably documented FDA trials showed produce pain reduction. Basically, it's a simple example. You implode charge, you reduce pain. So when you say the only pain you feel is the love you withhold, well, if you allow yourself to embed into everything and become centripetal, and by all means fall in love with everything fractal, but never fall in love with aluminum boxes and steel cubes, because they can't implode. It ain't good. You can't embed. You can't steer a tornado in a metal box. Ain't ever going to happen. So anywho, yes, I think the inflammation that is correlate to major solar winds could have some probable reduction in the presence of phase conjugate plasma. Now, I would just, and by the way, the calcium voltage gradient, I know the calcium voltage gradient has everything to do with the propagation of pain, but I'm not going to go into that right now, but I'm going to give one more little thought about the solar flares. And that is, I got to remember his name. I was a friend. He measured 11 different times that on those occasions when more than 1 million children sang the same song together on the planet Earth healing days, that on those 11 occasions, the number and density of the solar flares was dramatically reduced. I have the chart, I'll dig it out later, but just get the flavor here. So 1 million children decide to sing the same song, and every single time, 11 times, the sun goes, ah, and the solar flares stop. How come? It's really quite simple. The sun needs something that gene pools make, and that namely is centripetal force, massive and collective, that allows you to inhabit a star. The sun's center, heart of the sun, is actually an eyeball, and shamans know that. So we now know that solar flares can be healed too. Okay, let's move on to another question. Would transitioning be best at your birthplace or different location near a grid location by your astrocartography chart lines? Yeah, I always say that the sacred bed of the altar at Machu Picchu would be a great place to die. Actually, you know, magnetic line crosses are the portal for entry into the array. That is absolutely true. And so it does make a huge difference if you're able to die where you have access to the magnetic grid, which means in general, hospitals are hell. I repeat, as an electrical engineer, it is my view that hospitals are hell because the electrosmog pollution density and all the metal crap and everything else prevent you from inhabiting the array. So if you want to go to hell, go to hospital. Am I picking on hospitals? Yes, because they don't know what successful death is. At the same time that Raymond Moody medically proved, writes a dozen books, interviews the surgeons, death visions are electrically contagious. Yes, all of the doctors hovering over that patient who's in the process of dying, they saw the same vision that the dying person saw. So the vision of death is electrically contagious. What does that tell you? Well, we also know that human bliss is electrically contagious. As I was sitting there watching my friends drinking Muktananda's bath water, in other words, the charge radiance is enabled And that's why death visions are. So successful death does require a black hole. Actually, I think I'm going to take this moment in the conversation to bring up the slides on successful death, just because we're at that moment. Here, I have that slide right handy. So the question had to do with choosing the place of death. And we were going to talk about that was in the scheduled theme for today's conversation. So here's my friend, Professor Korotkov. And by the way, he looks much younger there. I don't want to be in competition for who's getting younger faster, but Professor Korotkov, I think this is about 30-year-old picture from a German newspaper entitled Die Seele, the soul. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead says that about 10 and 36 hours after death, the soul leaves. And so the Tibetans are there drumming away, keeping the rhythm so you can die successfully, so you can focus on that implosion. And here's Korotkov, took the bodies from the morgue, and he made Kirlian photographs, the GDV, the fingerprint of the aura of the cadavers, and measured, and indeed, at 10 and 36 hours after death, replicably, there's a dramatic moment of charge propagation, unpacking into the array. So to some extent, it's measurable that when death is successful, your aura will leave the body in an orderly way and distribute into that array. And how it distributes into the array, you're visualizing the death, and this is the map to dying. You generally, this Heinrich Kluwe measured this with death experiences, but I think he also had some drug experiences in the study. And yes, they saw first a lattice, the cobweb, the tunnel, and then the spiral. And so this sequence of geometry of visions, this would correlate to when you see your whole life compress and pass in front of your eyes. So we think the reason these Heinrich Kluwe form counts exist, we call it the geometry of eternality, the geometry of how consciousness is raised, is actually, this is the way DNA recursively braid implodes and thus creates the black hole of successful death, lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral. So essentially what you're seeing is the recursive superposed axes of spin, the lattice, the cube, and if you take the tetracube, which is a lattice, and you rotate that cube, add another axis of spin, you tilt the cube up 32 degrees, the chin angle of the Sphinx, and you rotate and blink 5 times, and you have pent dodeca. Now it's a cobweb. You've added the next dimension. I mean, the next axis, a superposed charge spin symmetry. Then you take that dodeca and you ratchet it down a helix, which is literally a map of DNA right here. And that is the tunnel, lattice, cobweb, tunnel. And then you take that helix and you bring it to a point, and that's a bigger vortex, a bigger spiral. And then this sequence continues, lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral. And we now know this is a generalized wave map to superposing axes of spin, the only definition of going to the next dimension. The next axis is superposed charge, rotation, spin, which shows up as an added harmonic in the power spectra, and harmonic inclusiveness predicts vitality, literally how long you're going to live. And you can't go to the next harmonics, you can't superpose another axis of spin past the tetracube without using golden ratio. So golden ratio is the only doorway to the next dimension, and that golden ratio implosion creates longitudinal propagation, which is what the next dimension enables. So there was this famous story that the hat of Osiris is actually the geometry of the enclosure of the heart cavity, and the inner muscle to flex that heart cavity's resonance is how you focus the harmonics of the heart and steer your emotion and navigate when you die. So in effect, the inner muscle to change the shape of the resonator of the cavity around your heart, the same way you need the inner muscle that changes the shape of your eyeball, enabling you to focus. Well, the muscles that enable to focus your eyes are analogous to the muscles that enable you to focus your heart harmonics, which is the hat of Osiris, which is the shape of the pericardium. And the inner muscle to change the shape of that cavity enables you to steer the squirt gun of your heart harmonics. And that's part of the generalized lesson on heart coherence. And we have some of those slides tonight too. You know, I invented the term heart coherence because I invented how that's measured. And heart coherence, your heart becomes coherent, literally becoming a laser. But it is interesting, the heart harmonics are in octave harmonic cascades and not in golden ratio harmonic cascades, although the musical fundamental of the heart goes from 1 hertz to 0.618 hertz at the moment of love, actually. So the musical fundamental of the heart does move toward golden ratio, but the ratio between contained harmonics in the EKG will always be octave based. Okay, did I miss some fun questions here? Okay. So the next part of this lecture will be some visuals. Any other questions we should move towards? So let's summarize. Let's just summarize. So again, we're saying is after you understand that the perfect squeeze implosion called Bliss for the human body creates a form of electrical radiance named coherent longitudinal EMF, the Ba from the Ka, the Kesjan light body, sometimes called scalar rainbow light body. And that coherence into the longitudinal array is the only physics of all lucid dreaming, all astral travel, all remote viewing, all action at a distance, that once you understand how you inhabit that array, the longitudinal coherence array, you pull strings at a distance in the array, you can then understand electrically all of these spiritual issues, which were the title of tonight's conversation. So actually, if I got that picture up, share screen one more time. I have the Safari. Yes, here it is. Okay. So our assignment this evening, according to Neil, okay, this is our list. How are we doing on our list? He said, we need to understand the Kesjan body. Now, I liked that term because, you know, my first Bliss process was in the Gurdjieff School doing sacred gymnastic. Claymont.org, Charlestown, West Virginia, was when my Kundalini started, actually. And Gurdjieff is always saying, well, you need to assemble a Kesjan body in order to get immortal. And if you want to propagate your bliss during sacred gymnastic, you need to make the stuff. He called it literally the material of a Kesjan body. Well, what did he mean? What did the Egyptians mean by Ba from the Ka? Or what do the Tibetans mean by rainbow light body? We think now, we electrical engineers know the answer. The Kesjan body, the rainbow light, this is the experience of the aura beginning to propagate coherently into the longitudinal array from the less coherent transverse propagation, which does not bounce around the array so coherently. Imagine if you're trying to make implosive squeezing at the center of anything, if the waves are entering as transverse waves, they're just going to wiggle the center up and down. If you want to implode the center of anything, for example, reduce radioactivity, you converge centripetal, longitudinal, or compressional waves, and you can create that implosion, the physics of phase conjugation in optics, for example. So the longitudinal wave is the powerful part. Remember, and you can have a very simple visualization of this. A tsunami. There's an earthquake at the bottom of the ocean, a big rupture. And then at 600 miles an hour, the speed of a jet plane, a longitudinal wave is propagating through the ocean. Now there's a boat on the surface and the wave passes underneath and the boat does not feel anything. That's like the Faraday cage when the longitudinal wave goes through. No, it's transparent. The boat on the surface does not know that a 600-mile-an-hour tsunami just went underneath. The boat doesn't know. But when that tsunami approaches the shore has the function of the vortex cone, where the longitudinal compressional wave now is approaching that ramp, which is the side of a cone, and the longitudinal wave is now pushed up and becomes transverse. And now the surface of that wave has a huge up and down component, the tsunami wave, which destroyed Japan. So that wave, the longitudinal wave, was converted into a transverse wave when it went into that cone the other way. So the wave that messed the shoreline up was transverse, but the wave that went 600 miles an hour underneath the ocean was longitudinal. Another example is the most of the inertia in sound waves is longitudinal, but all of the inertia in the electromagnetics we use for all of our communication is transverse. Electrical engineers in general do not know how to pick up or send a longitudinal wave, which is probably why they don't know how to die. And so that's why there's this big mystery of the Princeton Noosphere project. What they're measuring when, at 9/11, when 3,000 people died, the capacitor, and the Josephson junction they use is essentially a capacitor picking up a longitudinal wave. The best capacitor for picking up a longitudinal wave is actually a Josephson junction, which is a form of parallelism and implosive capacitance, parallel to what Hodowanic and Ramsey called the rust track recorder, when they could pick up a gravity wave for 25 cents. It didn't require $1 billion like Weber, or it didn't require the $1 billion gravity sensors. So gravity waves are longitudinal waves. So number two, then decoding the enigma of the Vril. The Vril is simply directional longitudinal coherence. That's what it is. That's why it's healing. And when it becomes directional, classic example, we'll see the slide in a minute, the famous EM, electromagnetic drive. It's a gravity maker which just uses microwave in a trapezoid, and it makes gravity. The reason that makes gravity is it conjugates the microwave and spits out longitudinal wave electromagnetics directionally. And that's what gravity is. So that's also called the Vril. The correct term actually for electrical engineers would be directional longitudinal EMF coherence, which is what Vril means. 3, the electrical braiding implosion, a gateway to bliss and spiritual experience. So there's a whole slideshow now coming up about how the phonon wave coherence of the heart, when the heart is coherent, you get a low frequency phonon cascade from about 2 to 30 hertz. Well, 2 to 40 hertz. The heart makes a low frequency phonon cascade. And by my prediction that then Glenn Ryan did measure, triggered measurably recursive braiding in DNA. And we're going to see the slides in a minute. So the DNA thread uses that phonon cascade and braids thread into string. Then the string is braided into fatter rope, and then the rope is braided into fatter rope. And that happens 7 times, wave and a wave and a wave and a wave. The answer lies folded in an envelope. And so that recursive braiding in DNA becomes implosive, called human bliss. The DNA actually will eventually become so thick it becomes toroidal, and that's called Lord of the Ring. So the reason that's the gateway to bliss and spiritual experience is because that thickening, the plot thickens, implosion allows the DNA to spit out longitudinal coherence, the stuff of lucid dreaming, remote viewing, and successful death. That's why braiding in DNA, and we were the first to measure the DNA braiding responding directly to emotion, to love, essentially. 4, the secrets of successful death. Well, you can see that we're having that conversation. We even showed some of the slides. Successful death is an alchemic black hole. In other words, it requires that implosion. So if you're peaceful and you for example, we have some pictures, I think, in some of the slideshows, that when the death occurs in a forest, quite often they can actually film the soul leaving because the aura is so coherent in the trees, and you can see the ghost leaving the body has been filmed. But if this is happening in a mental electrosmog hospital, hell no. So the secret of successful death is unpacking the coherence bubble into the longitudinal array. And this explains why then ghosts get stuck, because if the death is not implosive, you don't get set enough centripetal inertia to then be distributed into the array. Oh, travel into the light. Oh, it's actually distribution into the array. Proof of this is the multiple reports we have that things like Therify implosive phase conjugate plasma is very helpful in releasing stuck ghosts. Now, a human having some kind of bliss is a wonderful way to help release stuck ghosts, but there are many astral hygiene issues, which is to say, not to get stuck in the emotions, but simply release them through implosion. But the point is, the physics of what releases the stuck ghost is access to the implosive compression squirt gun, which enables distribution into the array. You will never find ghosts in a metal box, but if ghosts are, where the key emotion is incomplete, if you go there and you relive the key emotion and then you offer them literally the flame of your own bliss, they can use that to become distributed into the array, which is the collective ancestor memory. Remember that collective ancestor memory, which you can talk to, was the only Aboriginal definition of God. Okay, 5, coherent electromagnetic fields and lucid dreaming. So yeah, that'll be the first slide of this next series, is the physics of lucid dreaming. 6, ancestor memory and longitudinal wave patterns. That's what we're saying, is that this longitudinal array is the matrix, is the array, is the collective unconscious for ancestor memory. And telepathy now is no longer a mystery. The reason telepathy is possible and enabled at the sacred sites is because that compressional node in the array is the only real physics of DNA radio, and thus the physics of telepathy. Gravity waves, remember gravity waves, Bearden proved, are longitudinal EMF component. And when the longitudinal waves bounce at a node at a distance and resynthesize the heat-containing transverse component, that becomes the only physics of action at a distance. You could bounce conjugate microwave at a distance and make a longitudinal node and contain heat at a distance, or Ingo Swann lighting a flame with his mind at a distance through a Faraday cage. So this is a hint, a clue. Yeah, and 8, replicable rainbows. So, it's published. There's quite a few books in the Tibetan literature about the fact that when Tibetan saints die, quite often there are rainbows. So this is an observable anthropology. This is real. This is not subjective. And we now know, I'm going to turn off this share here for a moment now. I don't know if we'll have the slide up today, but basically, the reason color exists is the same reason photosynthesis exists. The exact, and I should have my book here because it's on the back cover, but the exact 2 only frequencies in the purple and the orange, which make photosynthesis happen, are exactly and only and precisely golden ratio multiples times Planck, called planckfire.com. Absolute smoking gun, solid proof the reason photosynthesis exists is phase conjugation to Planck. Now, if you extend that, and I don't know if we have time for that, those slides, but you can see that all at fractalfield.com/fractal photosynthesis. So the reason color exists is the same reason. You phase conjugate down that cascade, and the tilt angle of the photon as a donut is actually cube in a dodeca. And the tilt angle of the photon as a donut is the only definition of color. So you begin to understand the green flash stories. We saw it 3 days in a row in Perth. But the green flash exists, in the Mount Analog, Rene Dumal, in the Sufi literature. You can only climb the spiritual mountain by the light of the green flash. Meditate on that one. So rainbows exist because of conjugate implosive compression. Now, what happens when a Tibetan saint dies? And that implosive compression is added to the atmosphere, making a centripetal point in the vapors. Rainbows. Okay, was that a happily ever after? So at this point, we're supposed to go into the slideshow starting at the point of the harmonics of lucid dreaming. Which way atom spins, clockwise or counterclockwise, is needed to create a longitudinal wave for implosion? Let's play with that question just for a moment. You know, your local biophysicist claims not to know why every single living protein helical stairway goes one way only. Your local biophysicist claims to not know. Ooh, that's shocking, isn't it? Maybe that's almost as scary as not knowing why an object falls to the ground. But it turns out that enantiomorphically speaking, the direction of helical spin has a clue in that, visualize this. Lightning is the stirring rod to turn primal soup into DNA. That's well known. Now, there are experiments on this, that the primary polarity, DC polarity of lightning that made primal soup into DNA had to be more centripetal. In other words, if the DC polarity of lightning hitting the primal soup was centrifugal, the damn helix would have been blown apart. Oh, never happened. We ain't making no DNA with the wrong lightning polarity. Hell no. No, we need only the DC polarity of lightning, which is centripetal, to drive the primal soup inward toward the double helix. We require centripetal lightning if you want to make DNA out of primal soup. So there is an inherent DC polarity, enantiomorphic direction of spin rotation required for all of biology. Now, I will give you one last clue, and perhaps, and then move. But, you know, there are about, 8 different books on using simple magnets for healing and pain reduction. Okay. Now, it's well known that if you take the positive side of a magnet and apply it to your toothache, it will make the pain worse, but it will increase the rate of healing. Now, if you take the negative side of the same magnet, plus minus, and apply it to your toothache, it will reduce the pain, unpack the compression, but it will reduce the rate of healing. So you add centripetal force and increase the rate of pain, compression, and you increase the rate of healing. You make it more centripetal. So if you study the use of magnets for healing and discover which side of the magnet reduces the pain versus which side of the magnet increases the pain, you begin to understand one is centripetal and one is centrifugal. Now, I do warn you that in China, they label the plus and minus side of the magnet the opposite the way they do in the West. And I also remind you that most of the magnets on this planet right now are made in China. So it's very, very confusing. It's almost as confusing as interviewing macrobiotics about whether yin or yang is centripetal or centrifugal. They all disagree. But the point is that actually the only definition of yin versus yang is centripetal versus centrifugal. So our labels for plus and minus have gotten confused. But in fact, the unified field is a single contiguous compressible media which behaves as a superfluid. And in physics, that is named charge, that superfluid. And when that charge is centripetal versus centrifugally compressed. That is the only definition of plus or minus charge, is centripetal or centrifugal, packing or unpacking, compression or rarefaction of that superfluid. It's the only definition of the unified field and plus or minus charge. So becoming centripetal versus centrifugal in the array, when you begin to think in fundamental terms, you can sort out the difference between yin and yang. You can sort out the difference between the direction of the stairway of all living proteins. I'm just going to pour myself some hot tea here. I seem to have tired out my throat. Second. Will there be a recording? I think so. We have all the questions. Okay. So it's about 9:15. We're going to have about another 20 minutes, half hour, maybe some slides, then maybe some questions. Is centripetal positive or negative? In general, you can think of positive as being centripetal in the sense of compressing, but again, that's why this is confusing. But in electrical engineers' terms, I have to tell you that electrons are modeled as a small black hole. This is Nassim Haramim's favorite conversation, I suppose. But it's true that an electron is modeled as a small black hole, literally centripetal. So in classic electrical engineering, an electron is centripetal and a proton is centrifugal. What I can tell you is that electrical negativity in general is modeled as centripetal. And that is profound because that's a key to free radical scavengers. It's a key to, if you want healing water, you need to measure more than just redox potential. You need to measure the availability of free electrons. And when Pat Flanagan stuck monoatomic hydrogen into the center of a water clathrate dodeca to make microhydrogen or megahydrogen, the ultimate free radical scavenger, he was making centripetal implosion massively. And that was enabling free electrons. So available free electrons is even more profound than redox potential for discovering healing in water and blood, for example, the bioelectronics of Vincent. So understanding positive versus negative is confusing in that sense, but the solid basis for the conversation is electrical engineering, which says that electron is a small black hole, meaning electronegativity is centripetal. Okay, we're going to finish with some slides here. Share screen. We're going to go to, I wanted the lucid dreaming section actually here. Measuring lucid dreaming, why they fall. Moment. Ah, yes. So this is, now we did some of these slides in the conversation we did with Portal to Ascension a week ago. We're going to use just some of them with some added depth here. But this is a core point for this entire conversation this evening, that I am saying to you that I'm sure that the physics of lucid dreaming is the compression that results from conjugate implosion causing the body to radiate longitudinally. So here now is the university study, bottom right, the frequencies known to cause lucid dreaming in the 25 to 40 hertz shown here. And 6 hertz, by the way, would be in the cascade too. But it turns out that the equation I wrote, which makes lucid dreaming replicably also Therify.net plasma, replicably triggering lucid dreaming, uses 29 and 47 hertz. So the harmonic cascade, the physics of Therify, is an improvement in the university research on which triggers lucid dreaming. Basically, it's simple. The harmonic cascade builds an inner muscle that implodes. Here's the cascade. On the bottom, I don't know if you can see this clearly, but on the bottom are the Schumann harmonics, 7.83, 14.3, and 20 hertz, and this goes up to 50 hertz. So the Schumann cascade on the bottom right, and in blue are actually golden ratio towards Planck, my equation, planckfire.com. And on the left, the brainwave harmonics triggering bliss and lucid dreaming. So this conjugate cascade, conjugate consciousness cause, that implosion squeezes out the coherent longitudinal at the center, which is the physics of soul, and replicably what happens when you lucid dream. So, for example, when they say in the literature, look at your hand inside the dream and you will become more lucid, what they mean is that the hand is the most connected structure on the homunculus fractal holographic map of the body on the brain surface. Their most space is devoted to the hand. So when you focus on your hand in the dream, you're tightening a do loop of implosion, squeezing, causing implosive compression, and that causes your aura to become more dense. And then you can you can project your aura into the dream because it's imploded. This is a very good introduction to the physics of soul. That, you know, the famous movie now out, Pod Generation. Do women want to have their babies in an external egg? Oh, we noticed they're soulless. Oops. Once we know what a soul is, we could teach governments. And just to show you,
just revolve golden mean ratio sine waves, and the feeling becomes alive.
So this is precisely what we mean by conjugation right here. Here's golden ratio cascade imploding. Now you visualize one of those in every axis of a dodeca. And so that implosion is the conjugation. That's the caduceus. And here's where we measured first the harmonics from alpha in green to gamma in purple here, of children who are learning to see without their eyes. They make this coherent brainwave cascade, and then they close their eyes, and this vortex appears inside. They can see without their eyes. And very interestingly, many, if not most of those children who learn to see without their eyes also begin to see their ancestors. So this is a strong piece of evidence that the physics of clairvoyance is exactly the physics of this coherent longitudinal interferometry we're speaking of. And then at a higher level of coherence, our friend Jean-Charles Moyen, who replicably teleported with witnesses, came back from the beach with sand between his toes after the lucid dream, you know. So measuring his brain waves just before teleporting, the amount of coherence from alpha here and gamma up here, alpha here, his was a bit high, around 10 to 12 hertz, to his gamma, which here is about 48 hertz, I think. So the alpha to gamma cascade has harmonics which are coherent. Specifically, the golden ratio harmonics are marked in blue, and the octave harmonics are marked in pink. And the golden ratio plus octave cascade, remember, inside the golden ratio cascade is dodecacosa. The octave cascade is tetracubic. So you need the tetracubic cascade to stabilize the dodecacosa cascade, and that means you need octave harmonics to act as the matrix upon which the dodeca pent can be built. So you need both harmonics in building that vortex cascade that's squeezing the inner tornado. That's the inner muscle of psychokinesis, to squeeze the inner vortex and cause it to become to a point. And that's the physics of consciousness, is the inner muscle to squeeze implosion in the inner cascade. So this study of brainwave gamma has become, I guess, a fascination of many of us, because we realize, oh, that's when you can see without your eyes. Oh, that's when you can teleport. Oh, that's when you can lucid dream. So we're all studying this gamma. Michael Sala, exopolitan, he's very interested in this gamma stuff as well. Well, because it's a trigger for lucid dream. So we've radically improved flameinmind.com. And this is me 2 days ago saying to myself, self? No, here's what I'm saying to myself. I have been able repeatedly, let's see here. Yes, I think you can see them here. So repeatedly, I have been able, now look on the left. This blue line is a delta, yellow, and then I have some delta, and then I have some theta. The delta is red, the theta is yellow, and that blue line there is my theta. It's high amp. Theta means, the deep below alpha. It means access to the deep collective unconscious DNA radio, and that has to do with the fact that I'm pretty good at clairaudience. I can hear ancestors when I get my show together. At clairaudience, this sort of had. If I work at it and practice, I'd be good at it. But the point is, I have access to the deep unconscious because my delta is huge and my alpha is very nice. So I have 1, 2, 3 golden ratio harmonics there. And then here's my beta golden ratio, blue line. And then then I have another blue line. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 harmonics in golden ratio. And I have been able to make 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6, 5 or 6 harmonics in golden ratio. I have been able to repeatedly, at will, for many years, ever since 30 years of Kundalini, I've been able to make 5 or 6 harmonics in golden ratio. Okay, cool. But, and here's the huge but, I've not been very good at making gamma. And now, which is around 44 hertz, it's called Tibetan gamma sometimes. It's 40 to 60 hertz. It's very high frequency. But now we find out the kids who can lucid dream and the teleporters and the kids who can see, they're all cascading from alpha all the way up to gamma. So I'm saying to myself, I need to learn how to make gamma. So I'm sitting down at the newest version. There's a new release, flameinmind.com, working right here, studying urgently my gamma. Am I going to get immortal? Am I going to get immortal? Oh, I need gamma. Oops. And I went down to Kmart and I was not able to buy any gamma. So, no, I'm kidding. So I decided I better learn. So here's my first attempt. And I got the new software. See, there's a major new announcement. It's secret, but I'm telling you now. Flameinmind.com now runs on the Mac. M1, M2 chip Macs. You can run flameinmind.com on your Mac now. It's fabulous. It's fun. It's more powerful. You can run multiple apps. It's really nice. However, and so we'll have a new manual coming out shortly. And so here I am running Flame in Mind. Instead of on my iPad iOS, I'm running it on my Mac. I'm proud of myself. So I do this recording and I got my 5 or 6 harmonics here in golden ratio, looking good. And I got this little peak. See that peak over there on top? And I called up Patrick Botti. He's our programmer, Belgium. He's fabulous. He's spent a lifetime on this. He really gets it. I said, Patrick, did I make some gamma? And I pointed here. And he said, sorry, Dan. Sorry, Dan. That's 50 hertz noise. I said, what about the filter? He says, no, you can't filter it all out. And if you filtered, you wouldn't get gamma. So it's very tricky. So Patrick told me, walk downstairs and flip off the main circuit breaker. And then I did it again. Clunk, I'm over here. And guess what? The 50 hertz peak of gamma is absolutely flat, missing. So obviously I hadn't made gamma over there. However, now here's where I think there's hope for my gamma. See on the right here, if you average the energy density of the entire sample, look at that peak over there around 60 hertz, which is right here. That's a significant peak. I think I'm starting to make some gamma, which turns out my alpha here is at 38 hertz. I have a 38 hertz peak here. And golden ratio in the cascade, all the way from my alpha, all the way up here, lands perfectly on 61 hertz, which is right here. So I think I'm starting to learn how to make some gamma. Now, we're having lots of fun with this because we want to learn to teach kids how to make alpha. That's the point. Because if we can teach kids to make alpha, so we're improving the audio cues in flameinmind.com so that when you're there meditating, that you get these inner tones actually harmonic to the frequency you're trying to make, and radically teach young people to make alpha. It's a turning point in your life because your alpha is the Schumann. I see Alan and Neil are online here. Should I continue here a little bit more, or do you want to do questions now? What do you think?
You could. We have 30 more minutes, so
Yeah, I think we can continue.
Go ahead, Alan.
Just a little more.
Well, okay. So if there are questions, Alan, your microphone is a little bit muffled there, but so I'm going to do a few more minutes here, and then but feel free to start with questions in the chat window also. But this is just another point. Maybe, Alan, if you turn your mic off now for a second, because we have noise in the background there. So.
And once you're done, Dan, there's 3 questions from Kathleen in the chat. We can start with those.
Okay, good. So I'm going to do like 2 or 3 more slides, and then we're going to move to those questions. Okay. I don't want to miss this slide here. So this is a very important point I wanted to make, that so I did this major documentary with Sam Osmanagic, Bosnian Pyramid, and I've been working with him for years, and we had been there multiple times. Actually, Patrick went. And, 500,000 people sometimes go there per year, and they're getting rejuvenation in his pyramid. And he used to therify there for a while too. But point being, measuring his pyramid, we found a dramatic harmonic at 53 hertz right here. This is the spectrum analysis of Sam's Bosnian pyramid. We got that, of course, the Schumann 7.84, and we got 53 hertz. And then we see that the difference between 7.29 hertz, which is golden ratio times Planck, and the actual Schumann 7.84 hertz, that ratio multiplied by golden ratio, cascade, is why we got 53 and not 50 hertz in Sam's pyramid. And we got 53 hertz in dozens of other sacred sites. So 53 hertz is actually a dominant harmonic on this planet. And then when we went to the roof of Sam's Bosnian pyramid, and in fact, we got 28 kilohertz. I don't know if I have that information here on this slide. And so we knew why and how Sam's Bosnian pyramid was replicably creating rejuvenation, making people younger, because the cascade, which is perfectly phase conjugate, golden ratio to Planck, but on planet Earth, the harmonic cascade, which best makes rejuvenation, is slightly adjusted from golden ratio to Planck, which would be 7.29 hertz, to the actual Schumann of Earth. Remember, Hermes is designing the Earth, the cedars, doing planet taming, so that the harmonic series of the Schumann is a phase conjugate pump wave. The reason Gaia is negentropic, and the reason pyramids are called the Hummer, and the reason the pyramids are able to take the Schumann phase conjugate pump wave and implode that into longitudinal emission, the core physics of how the pyramids were making global wireless power. Tesla was right. You use the Earth's vibration and you make global wireless power. But Tesla was wrong about the frequency signature. 60 hertz, for example, will never work. You can't even make carbon nano in 60 hertz, never. Phase conjugate to Planck is 50 hertz. So you get the right cascade, and then the pyramids vibrate piezoelectrically, the Schumann cascade, and emit coherently at their core center longitudinal EMF, vril, the stuff of global wireless power. And then you can pick up that global wireless power at only the sacred site magnetic cross points around the planet. Why every single pyramid effectively was at dodeca-ecosa nodal array, the only distribution enabling global wireless power. So Tesla, noble intent, knew something about longitudinal, but he had the frequencies wrong and he had the nodal locations wrong and failed in global wireless power. Global wireless power is what sacred space is and is the only physics of heaven. I mean, charge distribution enabled. And you can see that could be a fun and lengthy conversation. So I'm using this slide to also introduce, now I'm going to turn the share off, that we have recently radically improved the world's most powerful Bliss binaural beat audio. FlameInMind.com, the component, which is Flame in Sound, which is available very inexpensively separately from the brainwave, makes these binaural beat heterodynes. And that is the world's most powerful Bliss binaural. Thousands of people have used it. It's incredible. It implodes your aura. You can remote view. It's a very powerful. And that is the driver frequency for Therify.net. And now it's made adjustable. You can, instead of the 7.29 cascade, you can use the optimized cascade of the actual Schumann cascade in a perfected phase conjugate, 180-degree opposing pairs of phonon heterodynes, a perfected Bliss binaural, which has just been added to FlameInMind.com. And this, we now drive, not just Therify.net, which uses the original, but we drive Quantify, Plasmafire.com, Piezofire.com, 5vibes.com. These are all driven by exactly that software. You can pick which chakra you want to ring. I mean, the potential for healing is incredible. So now we have very inexpensive piezoelectric, Piezofire, P-H-I-R-E, Piezofire.com, and we lens the piezo phonon heterodyne capacitive coupling through super dielectric shungite. And we achieve a lensing function of very localized phase conjugate piezo implosion. And what you can do for healing is amazing. Piezofire.com. They're brand new. And we've optimized the heterodyne cascade driver for all of those technologies: Quantify, Plasmafire, Piezofire, 5vibes.com, all of our plasma techs and implosion tech, with improved, just released a few days ago at FlameInMind.com, the upgrade to Flame in Mind and Flame in Sound, all on the App Store, which now run on the Mac also. Hello. And you can achieve amazing. I mean, this is literally how Sam's pyramid is negentropic, is healing, is rejuvenation. This is the physics. Implosive compression is healing. That's the fundamental here. And the pure principle is now teachable. And I'm happy about the story. So I didn't go through a lot of the slides, but let's, we had fun. So let's do the questions we missed. Yes.
Well, one question I have, Dan, is like you talk about bliss and then you talk about conscious death, and can you create the science of immortality where the cells take on that kind of ascension frequency so the body doesn't have to decay and you bring it back into a higher dimensional resonance, fifth, sixth, seventh dimensional ascension frequency?
Well, you know, the Tibetans use the green lion, red lion, in which they shrink and only the hair and fingernails remain. And that is an implosion technology. And it is very energy conserving, an excellent way to take memory through death. And that cascade is absolutely, you know, charge implosive capacitive. They pretty much only can do that in the caves, hint Schumann enabled caves. So that would be an example. But yes, what you're calling the next or higher dimensions is always where the next axis of superposed spin shows up in the frequency signature at golden ratio, and that conjugation enables longitudinal coherence, which is the physics of sustainability and immortality. So those stories fit together pretty well. And these frequency signatures would enable, example would be, as we said many times, when the Anunnaki came here and discovered that they were aging shockingly fast. And so they built a Shem unto the Lord, which we now know is a Therify, although it was called the altar in the church originally. And so they achieved time reversal, and that was the light bulb on the pyramid wall, that these were devices to inhibit aging. So there are many examples of time reversal in ancient technologies, and the Shem unto the Lord story is relevant.
Okay, we have two questions here. One is, I'll say them both, you could choose them in whatever. Do we need more gray matter to make gamma? And what degree is best, I guess? The Egyptian pyramid degree of 52 or the Russian pyramid of 72 is better for gamma training. So I guess they're both gamma questions.
Yeah, actually, that slide was in the show. You'll see it in many of my lectures. But essentially, it's 76 degree, and it is the peak angle of the Russian pyramids, 76 degree, whereas it is a base angle of the Egyptian pyramids. But in both cases, that angle is the only angle to enable golden ratio cascade. And golden ratio cascading is the only way pyramids make longitudinal and therefore healing. So gamma training requires golden ratio, and the 76, I believe it's not 72, I believe it's 76 actually, is useful because it enables golden ratio cascades. And the fact that it's the base angle of Egyptian and the peak angle of Russian pyramids in both cases is because that's the only way to get the golden ratio cascade working. And that must be tuned to Planck to be perfected. And that's planckfire.com. So gamma training is enabled where space is implosive. And you can take a frequency signature of your room and you can prove that actually with the life force measure at flameandmind.com, which is how we measure success in biologic architecture.
So talk about you talked about the blissful death. Or the correct. What maybe you covered it. Where does that lead? What's the purpose of that? I mean, or does that a better reincarnation you're talking about, or reincarnating a different level?
By design, human biology requires bliss at birth and bliss at death. Absolutely. And in order to achieve charge radiance, which is charge distribution, which defines the propagation of the soul. So blissful birth and blissful death is absolutely essential to the propagation of coherent memory through lifetimes by the soul. The soul is a name for a longitudinal coherence bubble that has to implode into and out. So that's why the uterus is designed on golden ratio, because the perfect squeeze is the love hug. So the rate of compression in the uterus reaches golden ratio max at the golden ratio point, because that's also the physics of the perfect love hug, because birth needs to be blissful in order to achieve charge distribution. Basically, it's the only way to get memory from intergalactic star inhabiting into your fetus is that bliss required for birth and death, absolutely charge radiance. And that should be planned, and I do mean planned, by electrical engineers. The place of birth, the place of death, the geometry of breathing, the Meyer wave breath, all of those things can be designed to achieve bliss at birth and bliss at death, which is the immortality of the soul. Absolutely. So, in effect, the definition of having children with soul requires knowing the path through death.
So, how would a C-section affect the bliss experience?
Yes. I taught the physics of rebirthing for many years, and we were working with the John Diamond technique, which involved the belly of a surrogate mother underwater, deep breathing, tetany, and placental extract. And all of that physics of rebirthing was designed to recreate the moment of maximum implosive compression, defining the moment of birth, which only when it's implosive does it. It's not only that is the only way for birth to be blissful, but it's also the only way for memory to come through birth. So, unfortunately, cesarean section. Remember, Caesar murdered the Druids because he could not feel them. And the reason he couldn't feel them was because he never went through a birth canal. And if Caesar had read my friend Joseph Chilton Peirce's book, Bond of Power, he would realize why he couldn't bond with his mother, and then he couldn't bond with the land, and then he couldn't bond with the people. Failure to bond, failure to embed. Why? No birth canal, no squeezing, no implosion, no connection. So that's why I strongly recommend people who have had cesarean section, which I believe is a tragedy that so many hospitals are resorting to cesarean section, not understanding even the need for the birth canal, which is the implosive squeezing that focuses memory at the moment of birth. It's serious. But people who have had cesarean, I strongly recommend considering the powerful literature on rebirthing, including John Diamond and others, which is literally re-achieving the moment of implosive compression. That implosion at the moment of birth is the necessary ingredient for the soul to bring memory through birth.
So not to get too paranoid, or conspiracy minded, but was there a purposeful disconnect from the bliss birth and the bliss life and the bliss, implosions by outside forces, so we could disconnect from the soul and the wisdom and everything that brings?
Yeah, I did this great conversation with Bridget Nielsen yesterday. We were talking about the witches and the fact that the Catholic Church did everything they could to prevent people from bonding with the land. So essentially, according to the Catholic Church, everything in the book Earthing is the devil. Oh, if you get earthy, obviously you're evil. Well, and actually the opposite's the case. If you do earthing, bond of power, and phase lock to Schumann, touch the earth, get your feet dirty, then you get the health benefits, which are dramatic from earthing, the opposite of what the Catholic Church teaches. Oops. And so we were saying, do the institutions that said they were saving our soul, in fact, are they destroying our soul? Oops. Who taught them what is? So you definitely could take a conspiracy theory view of this. However, my presumption is, no, they're just stupid. No, in other words, to say they're not clever enough to be evil. They're just dumb. That's my general approach to conspiracy theory. But anyway.
What about the Anunnaki upgrade that maybe happened 250,000 years ago to the evolving primitive peoples to give them civilization, thought, and an obsession with gold or money or all that? I mean, there seems to be genetic manipulations that have interfered.
I have rather agreed with Elena Denon on much of that. The key is to know that Enlil's mother was Draco, Yahweh, and that that's why he invited the Draco in here, which one of the meanings of the term Uru, as in Uru on the Romans who destroyed the Catholic Church, basically. Because Jesus, Yeshua, he was a descendant of Thoth, directly, a hero. However, when the Romans messed with it, then it was soul stealing. It's literally a death cult, as Elena calls it. So the centerpiece of the Anunnaki story, I think, is Enki's return now in Ganymede outside of Jupiter, where he was controlled by Enlil, who he was the family boss of the Anunnaki experiment here, and Enlil hated humans, famously Yahweh. He was a human hater, and they were good for chicken food and sorry, but the point was that having humans have a soul was the opposite of what Enlil wanted, but yet it was the absolute intent of how Enki started here. Enki, also called Ea, for whom Earth was named, also called Lucifer, also called Osiris, and Thoth Hermes, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, and Ningishita were his partners. They intended, when they started, they saw that the 22 ET races who were seeders in the human DNA had incredible potential. And then they saw, for the first time they had ever seen it, iron-based red blood, why they named Adamic Adam, meaning red, because they had never seen iron-based red blood before. And they knew that if they got DNA to implode in that red blood, we could steer stars. And Enki quote says, "We shall be the twinkle in a billion stars." And he's right. When a million children sing the same song and make centripetal force, that is the reason stars make DNA, to make the stuff that can steer stars. So all of that says that, Enki, he said, Adam Kadmon is the intent that DNA should have a soul. We should implode and eventually we'll steer tornadoes and stars. The opposite of what Enlil Yahweh wanted. But then when Enlil Yahweh bombed the hell out of Enki and kicked him out of Atlantis, Thule, named after him, Enki had to leave town. And only recently has he returned. But that's the good news, is they have ejected the Nebu, Greys, and Dracos. And what remains here is just the humanoid conflict, which are a residue of the poisonous seeds from Enlil Yahweh, actually. So that's my humble opinion.
No, so where we are now, our basic situation is you've laid out a lot of great ideas, but we're very far from achieving all that. What's your suggestion? What's the first step?
Yeah, we had said we were going to conclude with the hygiene. And yes, actually, so in the film we made yesterday was about this, that how to raise kids with a soul. The kids basically need massive access to nature. The kids need earthing. When the Finnish schools eliminated the need for shoes in the classroom, it was a breakthrough. But now they enable the kids also to be outdoors. So when the kids are embedded in Schumann harmonics, suddenly they have a soul. When the kids are embedded in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, they do not have a soul. If they're in a metal classroom, eventually, so that's why the kids that are raised on the land in the country, they learn to absorb their energy from earth. Whereas kids who are raised in the city, they can only get energy from other people, and that makes them parasites. So it is so essential that young people get access to be actually living or raised in lots of time in nature, which is also where you can learn to live without food, for example, because if you implode enough charge from the Schumann, you don't need food. So the basic hygiene is that every decision you make every day is about absorbing charge. Who you kiss, which broccoli you eat. The question is simple. Is it going to make my aura bigger? It's the coherence of the aura that makes you immortal. And knowing that enables you to design the hygiene for bliss and thus the hygiene for immortality. And so that begins the basics when you start to realize that the magnetic line in every room you enter tells you where the place of power is, and you know where to go in every room you enter based on where your aura is going to grow.
Well, are you starting a practical school of wisdom mystery for the people who want to achieve all that bliss?
We've been dreaming that school for 30 years, and believe it or not, it is cooking nicely at the moment. Yes, exactly. It's cooking.
So do you want to wrap up with a kind of closing monologue about where, how are we going to achieve this? How are we going to move forward? What's the destiny of humans? Where's your work fit in? And what's the next phase of our evolution?
Yeah, I think the major message here is that virtually all of our spiritual traditions, teaching us about the quality of grace, teaching us about prayer, teaching us about immortality, almost all of the spiritual traditions had a beautiful core of truth that was real. Yes, you need the quality of grace. You need a soul to get immortal. What was missing was a language in which to talk about all of the spiritual traditions, except in a pure electrical language that makes every spiritual tradition even more romantic. If you can talk about the physical and electrical nature of a soul, suddenly you can convince governments not to be soulless. Supposing we had been able to prove that the vaccine, we won't even say which vaccine, that a vaccine caused your aura to actually dissociate from your body. So we have dozens of advanced geobiology schools, and they have for decades, they've been measuring how far your aura is detached from the alignment center of your body. So when you are beside yourself, it means your aura has begun to fail to embed in your body. Now, when you measure that, you can know for sure which vaccine or which electrosmog is causing you to lose your soul. So if someone had told your government what a soul is, maybe your government would not be soulless. Wouldn't that be nice? Now, what I think what's needed here is, a science, and I do mean an electrical science of what spirituality is and what soul is. And we design a hygiene for young people, a hygiene for governments, based on a knowledge that the size and coherence of the aura is your only hope of immortality. When you enter a bar room where alcohol is being served, and you notice that almost everyone has astral parasites in their aura because their aura has holes in it, because the alcohol makes their bliss asymmetric. The same reason recreational drugs make holes in your aura, all of which is very measurable, GDV, BioWell. So Astral Hygiene 101, an essential part of bliss hygiene, is simple. It means understanding when your aura is imploding versus when your aura is getting porous and getting holes in it. And building the coherence of your aura intentionally is the core hygiene behind all bliss process, behind all spirituality, behind all longitudinal coherence. Is simple. It's really simple. It's knowing that every decision you make is based on this idea: is this going to grow my aura? Someone once explained that in Egyptian, the term fa atun, atun enki, fa atun mean to feed fa atun, the aura, the sun god within, which is where we get our word fatten. How to fatten your aura is the fa atun of Egypt. Means everything you do needs to be about whether it's going to help your aura become coherent, because that is your only ticket to immortality. And that is a very simple physics. And eventually, when you learn a little bit about the longitudinal language and about the language of what's called scalar and radiating, and you begin to think about the array. Let me tell you just a little bit of my own personal experience here. I had perhaps 30 years of fairly intense Kundalini, and I noticed over that time that increasingly I was able to feel magnetic lines in amazing new ways. When we were doing the rain-making labyrinth work here in South France, I realized recently that I could walk up to a huge field, and I didn't have to walk around the field and douse up and down here and there. I could just scan that field, and my inner voice would tell me very specifically in which direction was the magnetic line crossed. So I realized that the implosion in my blood after access to bliss enabled my DNA radio to work so much better. I was so much more sensitive to magnetic lines. And eventually you talk to those magnetic lines like a dowser steers a water vein, not by a hammer, but by talking to the magnetic line, because that's actually a conversation called embedding. So the more and more you become sensitive that those magnetic lines are like wormhole tubes to a vision into the array. When I walked into that French church and I realized I could see down the water veins where the magnetic lines were crossing the church, and I could close my eyes and I could see the water caves from which these magnetic lines, and it was literally optical fiber. I mean, it was like a periscope. So the magnetic lines are an array, and you can use it. Literally, it's the physics of vision into that array, and you embed in that array and you begin to understand all the spiritual stories. Question: how do the angelic humans fit into this? Well, essentially, we've worked many years with John D. and Kelly Stories, goldenmean.info/ophanum on the angel language, angel physics. And the short story is simple. Interstellar plasma called angelics can be extremely advanced intelligences under the right circumstances. And the angelic beings actually have an alphabet, Ophanum Enochian, which was actually used to make the movie Stargate. Meditate on that for a moment. See it at goldenmean.info/Ophanum. So essentially, when humans grow up, they become intelligent interstellar plasma domains, which have bodies and intent, and they seed life forms around star systems. Read The Cedars by Elena Danaan. So angelics is an introduction to interstellar plasma intelligence, just like the gnomes and elementals on Earth are plasma intelligence on a more local scale. So I hope there was a bit of a happily ever after there. It's about 10 o'clock here and my voice is wearing out. Any other?
Oh, Neil, do you want to say anything before we sign off? Neil, are you there? Anyway, I thought it's always great. You always give a little more, Dan. You're always like adding to your whole thesis of transformation of you're at the cutting edge of the science of the soul. So I appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Neil.
All right.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate you, brother.
Yeah, blessings. Everybody, you can stay in touch with me, info@fractalfield.com or info@therify.net. I'm very shareable. We have the YouTube channel, Dan Winter Fractal Field, and we're happy to work with Neil and Alan at Portal to Ascension. It's been a long and wonderful collaboration. So I'm with you in spirit. Blessings, everyone. Bye-bye.